to the latest episode of British History, Royals, Rebels, and Romantics, the podcast for people who understand that history shows us what's possible for us in our lives today. I'm Carol Ann Lloyd, your host and tour guide as we travel back in time. We're shaking up history to look at the stories that don't always make the history books, to consider famous and infamous characters in new and interesting ways, and to look for all the things that we share, even when we're living in different times and places. I hope you enjoy this journey through the royals, rebels, and romantics of Britain. Now, let's explore history together. Hi there! For today's journey to the past, we are headed to the 14th and 15th century for an episode of The Family Feud. Hold on to your hats. We're entering the War or Wars of the Roses, and we're going to see how it all got started with one guy's love life. There are plenty of things to explore during this famous, or should I say infamous, time in history. We have Team Lancaster, already on the throne, made famous by their greatest member, Henry V, defeating the French at Agincourt. But they fall on hard times and have to fight to keep the throne. We have Team York, disillusioned with the losses in France and the king's inability to manage his court, making a play for power. We have amazingly strong women, including Marguerite of Anjou, Elizabeth Woodville, Cecily Neville, and Margaret Beaufort. The Wars of the Roses is actually much bigger and much smaller than we usually think. What was at stake wasn't simply a series of battles between York and Lancaster. These events shattered the norms that had held the English monarchy together for hundreds of years. The Wars of the Roses kept asking the same question: is it okay to get rid of the king? Sometimes the answer was yes. It's also smaller. It's the story of one man and how the descendants of his wife and the descendants of his mistress played nearly all the key roles in this giant power struggle. Just one man, John of Gaunt. So who is John of Gaunt? He's the third son of King Edward III, born in 1340 in Ghent, hence John of Gaunt. As the third son, his chances of becoming king are just about zero. But John of Gaunt pretty much wrote the book on how to have royal descendants. Here's what you need: a wife, a mistress, and children/grandchildren/great-grandchildren who have a willingness to take the throne they didn't inherit. With all of that, you end up with Yorkist and Lancastrian dynasties in your personal family tree. Gaunt's first wife was Blanche of Lancaster, daughter of the Earl of Lancaster. He married her in 1359. When her father and sister died, John and Blanche became Earl and Countess of Lancaster, then Duke and Duchess of Lancaster. This was the beginning of Team Lancaster. John and Blanche had 3 children who survived to adulthood: Philippa of Lancaster, Elizabeth of Lancaster, and Henry Bolingbroke, who was named for Bolingbroke Castle, where he was born in 1367. As the only surviving son, he was the heir to all of John's title and estate. When Blanche died, likely of the plague, in 1368, she was only 22. Gaunt married again, this time Constance of Castile. She was the daughter of the King of Castile. They had one surviving daughter, Catherine, who married another King of Castile and left our story. Sometime during his marriage to Constance, John of Gaunt began a relationship with Catherine Swynford, the governess of his 2 eldest daughters. That affair lasted about 10 years, and they had 4 children: John, Henry, Thomas, and Joan Beaufort. Why Beaufort? Well, John's children with Catherine Swynford were illegitimate when they were born. John of Gaunt acknowledged them as his children, but they were not entitled to the Lancaster name. The name Beaufort is associated with John of Gaunt being Lord of Beaufort in France. When Constance of Castile died in 1394, John of Gaunt married Catherine Swynford. He arranged for the Beaufort children to be declared legitimate. In 1397, Parliament passed a charter that declared the Beaufort children legitimate, and the Pope gave his consent. This significantly increased their chances of making favorable marriages and allowed them to pass wealth and land along to their heirs. John had done everything he could, according to civil and ecclesiastical law, to make his Beaufort children legitimate. But now there was an issue with Henry Bolingbroke. He had an uneven relationship with his cousin, King Richard II. In 1398, King Richard banished Bolingbroke from England. The next year, John of Gaunt did the final thing that would propel his family into the spotlight. He died. After Gaunt's death in 1399, Bolingbroke naturally returned to England to claim his birthright. But Richard II canceled the documents that would allow Bolingbroke to inherit his father's land automatically. Disrupting the legal transfer of a noble's land was illegal. Bolingbroke responded by raising an army and beginning a military campaign. The other nobles didn't like the idea of a king who was grabbing up their land, so they supported Bolingbroke. Big question time. Is it okay to get rid of the king? In this case, is it okay if you think he's doing things that are bad for the country? Bolingbroke answered yes. He deposed Richard II, who gave up his crown, was arrested, and died mysteriously in Pontefract Castle. Henry Bolingbroke was then crowned King Henry IV, October 13, 1399. But the anointed king, the man chosen by God to lead the country, had been deposed. Norms of monarchy starting to crumble. This is actually step one in the Wars of the Roses. It put Team Lancaster on the throne. The descendants of Blanche of Lancaster became the Lancastrian kings, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. Henry IV spent most of his reign fighting off rebels. Henry V became Superman and defeated the French at Agincourt. And Henry VI became king as a baby when his father died when he was off fighting the French. For the first several years of Henry VI's reign, his uncles and ministers managed to keep things together. But as he grew up, it became apparent he was no great king. He also had a French wife, Marguerite of Anjou, who was very unpopular. And he was terrible at managing the power struggles at court. While the Lancaster family was busy being king after king, the Beaufort family was gaining power and prestige as well. Descendants of John Beaufort served Henry VI. His third son, Edmund, became Duke of Somerset, a favorite of Henry VI and Marguerite. Joan Beaufort married Ralph Neville and had children and grandchildren who ended up on Team York. Cecily Neville married Richard, the Duke of York, and Richard Neville, Earl Warwick, sided with York as well. So we have Beauforts on both sides. Now, Henry VI surrounded himself with just a few favorites like Somerset, making the other powerful nobles feel disrespected. Somerset had a serious rivalry with Richard, Duke of York. In 1453, things reached a crisis when Henry VI fell into a coma-like state. He was unable to move or speak for months. Richard, Duke of York, was named protector. He sent Somerset straight to the Tower of London. York took full control of the king's government, and it looked like things might go on like that for years. But suddenly the king recovered. Somerset was immediately restored to favor, and now York was pushed aside. York was furious at Somerset's high favor with the king. He gathered supporters and continued to challenge for a greater role in government. Fighting broke out at St. Albans in 1455, which marked the beginning of a series of battles that would last nearly 20 years. Originally fighting for a bigger role in Henry VI's government, York eventually decided that a role in government wasn't enough. After all, Henry VI was a really ineffective king. So, big question time again. Is it okay to get rid of the king? More specifically, is it okay if he really isn't doing anything bad or wrong? He's just not a very good king. York decided the answer was yes. After all, the Lancastrians had ousted Richard II. Why shouldn't he do the same to Henry VI? In challenging the king, York was once again challenging the nature of the monarchy. Henry VI had been crowned and anointed as God's agent on the earth. How was it possible to rise against him? Once the norms are shattered, they stay shattered a long time. York fought for the crown. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was York's great supporter and became known as the Kingmaker. In 1460, Richard, Duke of York, was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, and his son, Edward, the new Duke of York, took up his cause. With Warwick's help, Edward defeated King Henry VI and became King Edward IV in 1461, more shattering of those norms that held the monarchy together. Now, family tree alert. 2 great-grandsons of John of Gaunt just fought with and took the throne from 2 other great-grandsons of John of Gaunt. In other words, the mistress's descendants just knocked the first wife's descendants off the top branch of the family tree. Of course, that wasn't the end. Edward IV got a little tired of Warwick always telling him what to do and decided to make his own decisions. One big decision was marrying Elizabeth Woodville instead of the French princess Warwick had in mind. Maybe it was on impulse because she refused to become his mistress. Or maybe he wanted to marry a woman with a large family so he could arrange strategic marriages with the nobles. In any case, Warwick was furious. The former supporter got even more angry when Elizabeth's family members scored prime court positions, and the kingmaker was pushed aside. Eventually, Warwick convinced the king's own brother, George, to join him in fighting to return Henry VI to the throne. Okay, so now we have George, Duke of Clarence, for fighting against his own brother, Edward IV. The kingmaker also now fighting against Edward IV. So the mistress's descendants are fighting against each other, and some of them are fighting for the first wife's descendants. This family tree is looking a little gnarly. Henry VI and his supporters won, and Henry was restored to the throne in 1470. His mental health had deteriorated, and he was mostly a figurehead. Queen Marguerite was calling the shots. Edward IV and his other brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, raised an army where they were in Flanders and came back to win the throne. At some point, brother George switched sides again and joined them. The brothers York won decisive victories at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. The kingmaker was killed, as was Henry VI's son and heir. Henry was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he mysteriously dropped dead. So the mistress's descendants claimed the top spot once and for all. In fact, with the death of Henry VI and his son, Blanche of Lancaster's descendants were gone. Catherine Swynford's descendants lived on. Edward IV was firmly established on the throne. He had 2 sons and 6 daughters, and things were looking pretty well sorted. But not so fast. Edward's hard living caught up with him, and he died unexpectedly, April 9th, 1483. Now, his eldest son was declared King Edward V, just as everyone expected. But wait, someone's not happy with that arrangement. In a move that surprised just about everybody, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, started arresting Elizabeth Woodville's family members and put the young king in the Tower of London on May 19th, 1483. Technically, that wasn't necessarily treacherous. All kings spend a night or 2 in the Tower before their coronations. But Edward V's coronation plans seemed to have ground to a halt. Soon, young King Edward's brother Richard joined him in the Tower, and at some point, Uncle Richard asked that big question, is it okay to get rid of the king? This was an easier move. This king hadn't even been crowned, and he was just a kid. Seems to have been an easy choice for Richard. Little more than a month later, both Edward V and his brother Richard had been declared illegitimate, and Uncle Richard had taken the throne as Richard III. This is a complicated and controversial part of the story. Richard betrayed the trust his brother Edward IV had placed in him when Edward made him Lord Protector of the realm during Edward V's minority. Richard also betrayed the trust of his 2 nephews when he said he would protect them and then put them in the Tower and left them there. We don't know exactly what happened to the princes in the Tower as they've come to be known, but it obviously didn't end well for them. Joan Beaufort's grandchildren were a mess of betrayals. Her great-grandsons were dead. Her granddaughter, Anne Neville, was married to her grandson, Richard III. They were first cousins, once removed. So another Beaufort is on the throne, but it's getting really messy. Now, what about John Beaufort's heirs? His eldest son, had a son and then a daughter for an heir, Margaret Beaufort. When John died, Margaret and the extensive land she inherited had been given as a ward to William de la Pole, who promptly decided to marry her to his son John. She was only 2 years old, and she later denied the marriage. In any case, it was dissolved. When she was 12, King Henry VI chose Margaret as a bride for his half-brother, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Edmund and his brother Jasper were the sons of Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow, and Owen Tudor. Edmund died a year after the marriage, by which time Margaret was already pregnant. A 13-year-old pregnant widow, Margaret went to Jasper Tudor for protection and had her baby at his home, Pembroke. It was a boy. She named the baby Henry. Henry Tudor. Yes, that Henry Tudor. So another Beaufort heir ready to grow up and make his mark. Henry Tudor lived in the center of the Wars of the Roses. As a relative of King Henry VI, he was in favor when Henry was king, and definitely out of favor when Edward was king. Henry and his uncle Jasper spent the final years of Edward IV's reign living in exile in Brittany and France. But Margaret Beaufort stayed in England, gaining favor with both sides of the royal battle. Not only honored in the court of her half-brother-in-law Henry VI, Margaret also gained favor with Edward IV and actually participated in the coronation ceremony of Richard III. Even so, she was laying the groundwork for the man she thought should be king, her son Henry. Margaret seems to have asked the big question for her son. Is it okay to get rid of the king? In this case, Richard III was a king that many believed had stolen the throne from his own nephew. Margaret was all in, and Henry shared her decision. Richard III had his share of enemies, and they were joining Henry Tudor in France. In 1485, Henry Tudor, English rebels, and a small military force made up largely of French and Scottish soldiers, who were mercenaries, sailed to England. Henry and Richard faced off at the Battle of Bosworth on August 22nd, 1485. Henry was victorious, and Richard III was killed on the battlefield. According to legend, Henry's stepfather, Thomas Stanley, rescued the crown from a bush and crowned Henry right there on the battlefield. Henry claimed the throne by right of conquest, dating his reign the day before the Battle of Bosworth. This meant everyone who fought for Richard was a traitor. Henry was crowned king and then married Elizabeth of York, the heir to the Yorkist claim to the throne. So, John of Gaunt's great-great-grandson, Henry Tudor, married his great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth of York, tying up the Wars of the Roses into a neat red and white rosy bow. Of course, the York claim to the throne also came from two of John of Gaunt's brothers, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, and Edmund, Duke of York. But I do think we can tell the story this way. John of Gaunt had a first wife and a second wife and a mistress who became his third wife. His first wife was the mom of Team Lancaster, starting with Henry IV. His mistress turned third wife was the grandmother of the matriarch of Team York, the great-grandmother of two Yorkist kings, and the great-grandmother of the matriarch of the Tudors. Finally, she was the great-great-grandmother of the first Tudor king. And those are all the key players in the Wars of the Roses. Thank you so much for joining us to explore how the Wars of the Roses basically started with John of Gaunt's love life. Please join us next time as we explore spies in the Queen's court. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please share with a friend. Do send any questions or comments. I'd love to hear from you where we should explore next. And please subscribe and leave a review. I'd really appreciate it. I'm so glad we could explore history together. Till next time.